Today, I will be discussing Phillis Wheatley, the first African American author of a published book of poetry. Wheatley has been overlooked when discussing American literature for many reasons. First of all, let us look at Miss Wheatley's background. In 1776, she was put aboard a slave ship and brought to Boston. She was purchased by John and Susanna Wheatley, who were prominent Bostonians. Phillis Wheatley was educated by John and Susanna's daughter, Mary. Phillis demonstrated that she was a quick learner. She was also educated in the classics as well as the Bible, which was custom in education during this time, although not for slaves, which makes Phillis unique for this time period. Only 16 months after her arrival, she had mastered the English language and at 12 began to study Latin. At 13, she began writing her own verse. The Wheatleys were delighted with the child prodigy that they encouraged her to write. This was not the norm for a slave owner to encourage their slaves to be educated. They even showed her off to the Boston Society, to where people would come to the Wheatley home to see her. Phillis Wheatley's literary career and background are very different from the more well-known Black authors. Why all of a sudden is there interest in Phillis Wheatley? As Anne Applegate, in her article, Phillis Wheatley, Her Critics and Her Contributions, believes this renewed interest in Wheatley is due to the Black movement and the attention given to literature produced by Black writers. In 1770, Phillis Wheatley published her first poem, and it only listed her as Phillis, a servant girl of 17 years of age belonging to Mr. J. Wheatley of Boston, and has been but 9 years in this country from Africa. Also, in 1970, 5 additional manuscript poems were found and published in the New England Quarterly. In Wheatley's work, you can find mostly the themes of religion. We're now going to look at the criticism that Phillis Wheatley has taken over time. Referring back to the article from Miss Applegate, she says that Wheatley was virtually ignored by scholars of American literature. It has probably been within the last 15 to 20 years where Wheatley's contribution to American literature has been examined. Many scholars have criticized Wheatley because she did not concern herself with social and moral protest against slavery. We need to look at why Wheatley would be reluctant to concern herself with the issue of slavery. One reason, Phillis had an unusually good circumstance of her life living with the Wheatleys and being brought to America as something not to protest. Wheatley's circumstance as a slave was not the norm for a majority of the slaves that were kidnapped and forcibly brought to America. Her work has been criticized by people even during her time, like Thomas Jefferson, who in his notes on the state of Virginia wrote that her poetry was beneath the dignity of criticism. Jefferson's remarks reflect much of the attitude of the elite towards slave intelligence at that time. One thing critics of Wheatley have failed to understand or grasp while saying she should have spoken out against slavery is that Wheatley was in bondage. Speaking out could have caused her to face tremendous suffering. Even today, we fail to think of the factors involved when analyzing things of the past. One cannot use a 21st century thinking or morality when looking at things of the past, as they were very different with different factors. Critics fail to consider Wheatley's status as a slave and need to read her work in the light of the social, political, and religious culture of the 18th century. And because of this, Phillis Wheatley has been greatly undervalued as a poet and as an abolitionist. Significant notes about Miss Wheatley. Phillis Wheatley was only one of 3 Americans who was able to publish poetry or prose while in bondage. The other 2 were George Moses Horton, 1797 to 1883, and Jupiter Hammond, 1711 to 1790 something, as we're unaware of the exact year of his passing. Miss Wheatley did challenge 18th century evangelicals by redeploying the same language and doctrine that the whites used to define the African, thereby undercutting conventional colonial assumptions about race and skin color. Phillis Wheatley also gave her fellow African American readers enhanced self-esteem with a new and respected ethnic identity, which created a strong foundation for their inclusion as equals within the Christian community.